Tredegar, together with its neighbouring early 19th century iron towns, did not develop gradually, but appeared almost overnight because of industrial demands for iron. Wars were raging across Europe. In a sense, Napoleon helped create the towns, and Wellington's battles ensured their early prosperity. Lands at the Sirhowy Valley head were divided between three different estates. Those in Breconshire, generally north of the later Merthyr-Abergavenny road, belonged to the Dukes of Beaufort, while those east of the Sirhowy River were Burr, later Lanova properties. West of the stream was owned by the Morgan family of Tredegar House, Newport. It was all poor agricultural land, providing little income for the estates, but beneath lay rich seams of iron and coal, limestone and fire clay, rising to the surface here along the coalfield's northern edge. Iron had been worked along this outcrop, possibly since prehistoric times, but by the early 18th century so few trees remained for charcoal making this had all but ceased. It was then that Ironbridge, Shropshire, the Derby's experiments with coke-fired furnaces opened the way for a South Wales industry which made this region iron-making centre of the world. By mid-18th century, exploitation of the iron belt had truly begun, most of its scattered farms being destroyed by a raw new industry which reddened night skies, a signal to rural areas that iron was being poured on the hills. New settlements developed rapidly south of a line roughly approximating to the modern A465 road, where minerals ceased. The ground beneath each town and village would soon become honeycombed with workings. A coke-fired furnace had existed at Sirhowy at least since 1778, but there are unproven tales of earlier smelting by Mr. Kettle, possibly a nickname because he is said to have made pots and pans. His small furnace, probably of riverstone lined with fire clay, smelted local ironstone dug from patches, a primitive open-cast system. Later and bigger coke furnaces used ore both from patches and drift mines. In fact, iron ore was called mine, those who cut it being miners, while others producing coal were colliers, that is, colliers. There was clear distinction between the two trades. But even enlarged and modernized, Sirhowy could not cope with ever-increasing demand. New furnaces were needed, as well as housing for workers who would serve them. Sir Charles Gough Morgan of Tredegar House, Newport, was anxious to increase income from his Bidwelty parish lands, but existing land acts restricted leases to 21 years, discouraging long-term capital investment. However, Morgan's widowed sister had married Sam Humphrey, proprietor of Merthyrs Penydarren Works, and the two brothers-in-law reached an agreement whereby, if Humphrey wished to build furnaces on Morgan lands, his 21-year lease would be regularly renewed, thus keeping the whole concern literally within the family. The Sirhowy Company was also anxious to expand, and in December 1799 at Glenaravan House, Sir Charles Gough Morgan and Sam Humphrey met with Matthew Monkhouse and Richard Fothergill, proprietors of Sirhowy Works. That day a new town was conceived to be named Tredegar Iron Works because it stood on Morgan lands. Indeed, this remained its postal name until after mid-century. Soon afterwards Tredegar was born, its new furnaces pouring white-hot molten iron and covering valley and hillsides with slag. Early iron ore was washed in river water at Sirhowy, scouring place on Beaufort estate land, while Sirhowy Works were sited on Burr territory, later to be purchased by the Harfords of Ebbw Vale. Other lands southwards would eventually become part of the Lanova estate. Lady Lanova was a strict advocate of temperance, permitting no public houses, much to the irritation of furnace workers and others. Tredegar was laid out as a planned town, its first grid of streets close to the furnaces, for no one desired long walks to work. Houses were of good quality for their day, not the slums we are led to believe, generally superior to those in rural areas. In all matters, the past should be judged only by its own standards. The problems which arose later were caused by an increasing population which outstripped housing and sanitation. People from country districts began flocking to work in this new iron El Dorado, which would provide houses, money in their pockets, and leisure time to spend it. Sam Humphrey, now operating both Tredegar and Penydarren Works, lived in a house southwest of the new furnaces, where prevailing winds would carry smoke and fumes away. In 1819, becoming an MP for Stafford, he handed over to his son, Sam Humphrey Jr., who then had a new residence at Welty House built nearby. Trees were planted, parkland enclosed, and a gamekeeper appointed. This luxurious building, equipped with coach house, extensive cellarage, ponds, gardens, and greenhouses, was a typical gentry house of the period, but would be considered cold, draughty, and uncomfortable today. Completely lost and forgotten until recent years, under this chapel-like building behind Bidwelty House was an underground storage room where ice, gathered from winter ponds, was stored to keep food fresh during summer months. This fine ice house possesses a massive iron drain cast in Tredegar works. Yet the Humphreys did not own Bidwelty Park. Like the rest of the town, it was leased from Tredegar Estate, reason why in 1901 Lord Tredegar was able to give house and park to the townspeople. During his first visit to Tredegar, he is said to have uttered, "Not much cover for grouse." But Geoffrey, 1st Viscount Tredegar, was a brave man who had ridden in the charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War. In 1839, in this very room, now housing a permanent exhibition of local archive photographs, Sam Humphrey and his family watched, probably with great consternation, Tredegar Chartists marching on Newport, but were cheered as the men passed by. Like many other masters, Humphrey was highly respected. He had even been asked to chair local Chartist meetings to ensure fair play. Sirhowy and Tredegar cooperated closely until 1818, when Sirhowy's 21-year lease expired. In 1802, Sirhowy lands had been bought by the Ebbw Vale Company, but Fothergill of Sirhowy objected to new terms offered by the Harfords, who then seized control. His reaction was bitter. Tramroad connections with Tredegar were torn up and machinery damaged or removed. In support, Tredegar Works refused to continue puddling Sirhowy iron, forcing Harford and Company to drive tunnels through the hill to Ebbw Vale. Fighting broke out between the two communities. It was dangerous for anyone to stray into the other's hostile territory. Eventually, it would cost Fothergill dearly. He was forced to pay £6,000, then a vast sum in compensation. The new proprietors marked their territory with stones inscribed 1818 and the letter S. They said it stood for Sirhowy, but Tredegar people believed it really meant success. Limestone essential as furnace flux outcropped at Trevel, a little distance north on Beaufort lands, and was brought to Sirhowy and Tredegar Works by the Trevel tramroad, whose vehicles ran within L-shaped plates. Many of these were still in use 100 years later, when horses had been replaced by a steam locomotive, an iron horse. Strangely, this seemed often to develop mechanical problems when near public houses. In 1816, Ben Hall of Rumney built his celebrated Brno tramroad from his Trevel quarries to the Brecon Canal at Talbot and Usk. The 1793 Canal Act permitted private tramroad links up to 8 miles in length, and this mound at Trevel's edge was both 8-mile marker and surveying platform. But Hall, whose son Lord Lanover had his nickname Big Ben given to Westminster's Bell, linked the Brno's 8 miles with another 4-mile tramroad to his Rumney works, contravening the Canal Act. Legal threats forced him to hand over operation to his engineers, Dixon and Overton. Although closed commercially in 1864 when railways killed both canal and tramroads, the Brno continued in use for chapel and Sunday school outings using horse-drawn trams fitted with seats. Others, so it is claimed, were employed as hearses to carry Trevel dead to their burial in Usk Valley graveyards, the mourners sitting on the dead person's coffin for this last journey. This rolling moorland north of Trevel was also part of the Beaufort estate, and until the 20th century's early years, many of that family and guests came here to shoot grouse. Local men would act as beaters, and sumptuous meals would be spread on this grassy Duke's table, whose seat was provided with a gap so that ladies did not expose their ankles while stepping over to sit down. There was even an underground leat to a stone basin where servants could wash dishes. Until not long ago, Sunday schools would bring their scholars here on Whitsun picnics, but then the feast would consist of fizzy lemonade and yellow slab cake. But there had been people living here long before any dukes or Sunday schools. This fallen prehistoric standing stone, probably Bronze Age and 4,000 years old, is not far from an enclosure of that same period. These lonely hills were once intensively occupied. There are remains of prehistoric ritual sites and settlements. People lived and grew crops here for thousands of years until massive soil erosion, combined with Icelandic volcanic eruptions, changed the climate and made upland life impossible. Ben Hall's Brynor tram road ran round the Crown and Valley, known locally as the Dyffryn, which, although in a different county and possessing a different culture, has always been regarded by Tredegar people as their own rural escape. Indeed, there are still family links between the two areas. These were the valleys to which Bronze Age upland dwellers retreated, leaving their abandoned burial cairns dramatically silhouetted against lonely skylines. Two local cairns have evocative names. Carn a Bugail, that is, Cairn of the Shepherd, is obvious in such an area, but why its neighbour was Carn a Velin, Cairn of the Mill, remained unclear until broken and roughed-out millstones were discovered nearby, obviously made here from millstone grit before being dragged away on sleds. Bronze Age people buried their important dead in stone cairns, clearing forest cover to grow crops on rich soils long since washed away. But although there seems no obvious connection between these lonely places and the iron towns, in 1839 local chartists were regularly crossing these moors, their chartist lights witnessed by Tredegar and Sirhowy people, perhaps too frightened to inquire what was really going on. By autumn 1839, Chartism, a movement originally intended to bring about political reform, had moved towards outright revolution, finally splitting both its supporters and local society. Newport was to be seized, signalling other British areas to rise, march upon London and take control of the country. Leaders Frost, Williamson, Jones addressed many meetings in the area, and from Skurva's Star Field the Sirhowy Declaration was sent to London, urging Queen Victoria to dismiss her Parliament and ministers. Even in today's liberal climate, such a request would be considered ridiculous. Then the government could only reject it, as was intended, and Chartist control passed to those who sought violence. Claims that weapons were made and stored in this cave seem improbable. Pikes were being manufactured in local smithies and stored with other weapons in public house cellars. A far grimmer Chartist association emerged when severed human remains were discovered, buried here deep within the cave. Dated to the Chartist period, these suggest that individuals suspected of spying might have been questioned, silenced, and buried here. Certainly an amazing secrecy was maintained at that time. The authorities had no inkling of what was intended. Alan Pinkerton, who later founded the famous US detective agency, claimed to have marched with Sirhowy Valley Chartists. Might Pinkerton have been a government secret agent? If so, and if discovered, his bones might also have moulded here, and he would never have hunted Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Tredegar's unique clock, an iron clock for an iron town, erected in 1858, was a tribute to the Duke of Wellington. It was apt. Wellington's campaigns had influenced the town's early development. Cast in Newport, the sections were carried on the celebrated Sirhowy tram road connecting the town to Newport's docks. Both the clock with its German-made movement and Tredegar's 1911 anti-Jewish riots are said to have been stated by Lord Haw, Hitler's broadcasting propagandist, as reasons why the town would never suffer German air attacks. But even as the iron clock was being raised, iron making was in decline. Not only were ore deposits being worked out, but steel was in demand, and the new Bessemer process could not employ local high-sulfur ironstone. Coal was now becoming king. Collier John Jones cut this huge block of coal from the yard level for the Great Exhibition of 1851. It was an amazing feat. Little wonder he was called Collier Mawr, Great Collier. Sadly, a section broke, and because of transportation difficulties, his achievement was not exhibited, although the smaller 2-ton block of Tredegar coal did feature in the 1950 Festival of Britain's Dome of Discovery. Iron towns were rough and violent places where drunkenness was rife. Beer houses abounded. There were probably 20 or more within a short distance of Tredegar Works. Young boys known as fetchers ran between works and pub, bearing the gallons of beer necessary to replace sweated-out body fluids. carrying with them some token the publican could recognise, so he could mark the debt on the slate, an account to be settled on payday. Drunkenness was a recognised cause of accidents at work. Every 4 to 6 weeks, many workers were paid by contractors in public houses, occasions when salty foods were supplied free of charge and paymasters often bribed to arrive late. At these times, the work ceased production, many workers remaining drunk and incapable until their money ran out. Yet these breaks provided opportunity for sober men to carry out essential maintenance, while the problems caused by drink inspired temperance campaigns throughout the area. Other workers, directly employed by the company, were paid largely by credit in company shops, such as that seen here in Sirhowy. The Tredegar company even issued its own coinage. These truck or Tommy shops were monopolies, their notoriety for poor quality in short measure giving rise to the expression Tommy rot or rubbish. Public house and chapel split the town into clear social divisions. Not only did they divide Chartists who advocated violence from those who desired peaceful change, but tended to differentiate between lawless and law-abiding elements of the community. Heavy drinking even became a tradition capable of export. In 1870, at Scranton, USA, a local Welsh newspaper complained about the immorality, drunkenness, and violence exhibited by immigrants who were Welshmen and Welshwomen from Tredegar, Rumney, Dowlas, Merthyr, and Aberdare. The scum of the works of Wales has been shipped here. Many workers and their families attended church or nonconformist chapels, whose Sunday schools made a vital educational contribution. It is hard to overemphasize the importance of chapels to local society. They inspired almost every cultural activity, readings, choirs, discussions, and public speaking amongst them. But when disease threatened, they became full to bursting point, causing services to be organized in shifts to accommodate worshippers, while the town echoed to hymns sung by the new faithful. So it was in 1832 and 1849. Drinking water was collected at spouts, iron pipes driven into spring lines on hillsides often near night soil, that is, human sewage dumps. In 1832 and again in 1849, cholera broke out in Tredegar, now known to be caused by water contaminated by diseased human waste, but then totally incomprehensible. People died quickly and in much pain. Ill at breakfast, dead by tea time, and buried by supper may not be too great an exaggeration. Many died throughout the region and in Tredegar itself. Chapel graveyards were closed to cholera victims. There was a belief the disease was caused by some miasma rising from graves, and a new burial ground was opened at Cefngola, high above the town, where it was hoped evil vapours would be blown away. It was remarked upon, but not understood, that newer areas of the town were less affected. In days before national health and social insurance schemes, the workhouse was a last resort for the desperate, although friendly societies helped their members during times of illness and need. It was not until 1890 that Tredegar Medical Aid Society was formed, developed from a similar scheme operated by the Tredegar Company. Both were financed by workers' contributions, the latter becoming so successful that a Tredegar man, Aneurin Bevan, as Minister of Health, modelled his new National Health Service upon it. The medical aid set up hospitals and surgeries, employing their own doctors and surgeons. One of them was A.J. Cronin, whose famous book The Citadel clearly relates to many of his experiences here. Indeed, his fictional characters were so obviously based on local people there was talk of libel action. The fact nothing happened suggests his observations were largely accurate. During his stay in Tredegar, Aberallo in the Citadel, Cronin lived in this medical aid property described in his book. In fact, he seemed to have disliked the long walks necessary to visit sick living in hillside terraces, and upon becoming a successful writer, quitted medicine altogether. In April 1837, the Hereford Times reported, "The appointment of the Superintendent of Police at Tredegar has already, we are happy to perceive, much diminished the riots and disorders frequent of late." Purpose-built in 1868, Georgetown Jail, as it became known, was headquarters for a large constabulary, providing living quarters, cells, and magistrates' court. Regular foot patrols and firm treatment of offenders did much to diminish crime. Few argued with men noted for their size and strength. Yet even they had difficulty controlling riotous mobs. Tredegar's small Jewish community ran shops which provided credit, pawnbrokers' establishments, and watchmakers, jewelers, which also loaned money. A contemporary citizen recorded they were regarded with affection for the help they provided during times of hardship. But in August 1911, a drunken mob smashed and stole from a Jewish shop, triggering other attacks, theft, and looting throughout town and area. The riot act was read, and soldiers brought in to help the police. Decent people were appalled, but this was still a shameful event in Tredegar's history. By mid-19th century, Tredegar had become predominantly a coal mining town. Iron working was in decline. Local ironstone was not only being worked out, but was unsuitable for the new Bessemer steel processes. The works began to concentrate far more on producing equipment for company collieries. Between 1800 and 1903, 38 pits and levels had been worked in the Tredegar district alone, and eventually its collieries would stretch southwards along the Sirhowy Valley and even across the hills into Rumney. The names of Whitworth, Tea Trist, Bedwellty Pits, Poaching, Markham, Oakdale, Wiley, and others were known wherever coal was mined or sold, but they've now all vanished. Output had increased amazingly. In 1873, this had totaled some 600,000 tons, but by 1923, 3 million tons were being raised annually, much of it shipped to world markets through Newport. 12,000 men were then employed, and the company had become leaders in workers' welfare. Model villages for their colliers had been built at Oakdale and Markham. Workmen's institutes and libraries were also encouraged and assisted financially. Indeed, a commentator of the period claimed, "It would be hard to find a better conducted undertaking in the whole of the coalfield. The Tredegar directors are enlightened pioneers." Much had changed since the primitive conditions of early days, and better ventilation and lighting had greatly reduced the risk of explosions. But even the Davy safety lamp had not been popular when first introduced. Men could now be sent to work in dangerously gaseous seams. In spite of this, in June 1865, there had been a huge gas explosion at Bedwellty Pits, when 25 men were killed and others injured. The whole town was plunged into mourning. A later report claimed Mr. Bevan, the manager, had been found guilty of manslaughter, but that this was considered unjust by the colliers and public at large. Indeed, there was another Bedwellty Pits explosion the following year, but this time with only one fatality. But coal mining remained a hazardous occupation, and many were killed or maimed in the pits. Funeral processions were commonplace, with long lines of mourners walking behind the hearse to hillside cemeteries. Most who remember Tredegar's days of coal will recall the 3:30 colliers train bringing men home from pits down the valley. Its arrival, marked by long blasts on the locomotive whistle, warned everyone that town streets would soon be filled with coal-blackened men in their pit clothes walking home to bathe. Pithead baths were a rarity, and men washed often in a tin tub in front of the kitchen fire before changing at the collier's off-duty uniform of navy blue suit, white muffler, and cloth cap. What was claimed to be the world's longest passenger train, here headed by a Webb coal tank, brought men home from the pits. Many colliers became self-educated men, and unions began to strive for better conditions. Strikes were a major weapon. Consensus between master and man had departed along with the Humphreys. Tredegar, still a good company, was now operated by managers who had to show a profit. Yet most who wished could find work, and the town prospered and trade flourished. Certainly riots and drunken disorder had been commonplace, but they'd also been established a staunch community with standards of decency and friendliness still obvious today. Under the Humphreys, Tredegar Company was surprisingly benevolent, building the town's market hall in direct competition with his own truck shop. It provided food during strikes, established medical assistance for employees, and free schooling for their children. Tredegar played a major role in British industrial history. In the 1830s, Daniel Gooch, who had become Great Western Railway's locomotive superintendent, received his basic industrial training here, at one time even making coffins for cholera victims. His mentor was Thomas Ellis, who had helped Trevithick build the first ever steam locomotive, and who would continue pioneering locomotive work, often improving upon Stephenson's designs. His son, Thomas Ellis Jr., became works engineer. Rhys Davis, who went on to build an ironworks at Richmond, Virginia, USA, had trained here. The Richmond Company was so delighted they named their new works in honour of Tredegar, the Monmouthshire town which had produced him. As a result, Richmond became both capital of the Southern Confederacy, with Tredegar Works as its major arsenal. Most Confederacy weapons were stamped with this name. Indeed, the American Civil War continued longer because of these works. This was but one of many U.S. connections. James Davis, a Tredegar man who emigrated there, became president of a large union before becoming U.S. Secretary of Labor under Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. In 1926, then president of the U.S. Moose Organization, he established it in the UK, with Tredegar as its #1 lodge. Tredegar was important enough for Field Marshal Haig to visit shortly after the Great War. Strangely, this marked a turning point. The war had brought prosperity. The peace would bring national strike and dreadful days of the Depression. Out of this period came close contact with the United Kingdom's political life. Aneurin Bevan, as Minister of Health, based his reforms on what he had experienced and witnessed at that time. Michael Foot succeeded Bevan as local MP. Neil Kinnock was born and spent his early days here. Both men became Labour Party leaders and exercised great influence upon British political development. All forms of sport have flourished here, particularly rugby football, which inspires a fierce devotion. Even recently, the ashes of Oswald Phillips, a lifelong member, were scattered on their playing field. When finally closed, the Tredegar Iron and Coal Company offices, control centre of a huge industrial enterprise, were eventually converted into an electronic factory, one of the first scientific industries to establish itself in the area. In 1970, a fire broke out shortly after Christmas, but the building was largely saved. It was not the case in 2000, when a more severe outbreak gutted the building so badly that it had to be completely demolished, razed to the ground. Now nothing remains of the company which created an industry, a town, and an empire in the remote Monmouthshire hills. Weary colliers no longer cross T-Trist footbridge hunched against winter sleet, or walk home in their pit clothes and heavy boots. That age has vanished without trace. For its 200 years of existence, Tredegar has contributed enormously to the nation's wealth, not only industrially, but through the people it produced. Remarkable men and women were born here, while others arrived and were influenced by its amazing vitality. Many achieved success in all walks of life. Whether doctors, lawyers, architects, business executives, politicians, or the rest, all seem to have benefited from their association with Tredegar, this iron town.